She was rejected in front of everyone. The director didn't lower his voice, didn't avoid gazes, and offered no explanations. The decision was public, cold, and definitive. For the system, it was control. For her, it was humiliation. What no one noticed was the exact moment something shifted. In the midst of that rejection, his instinct reacted against his own authority. A physical discomfort, a tension impossible to ignore. As if his body refused to obey the decision his mind had made. He tried to maintain control, but it was already too late. Something had turned against him. The rejection happened in front of everyone, because it had to happen that way. The system did not tolerate silent decisions when it needed to reinforce authority. The director knew this. He knew that every word spoken in public was not just an administrative choice, but a warning. He needed to show control. He needed to show that nothing affected him. She remained standing as the silence spread through the space. There was no defense. There was no protest. Only the clear awareness that this rejection was not about performance or technical flaws. It was about something she could never explain, something that had always placed her out of place. His gaze did not linger on her after the decision. That was part of the ritual. The system demanded emotional distance to validate difficult choices. Yet, the instant the rejection was recorded, something broke internally. Not in the system, in him. His instinct reacted against his own decision, not as regret, but as physical conflict, a tightening in his chest, an involuntary tension, his body refusing to accept what his mind had authorized. He tried to ignore it. He tried to follow protocol, but the sensation did not fade. On the contrary, it intensified. She felt it too, even without understanding how. A sudden, deep alignment that pierced through the humiliation and touched something more essential. It wasn't hope. It wasn't comfort. It was silent recognition. The system recorded the rejection as definitive. The audience dispersed. Normality was restored in seconds, but something had been broken outside the records. Something that did not answer to orders, positions, or control. He had rejected someone publicly, and in that very same instant, he had lost mastery over his own instinct. This story doesn't begin when she is rejected. It begins when his control ceases to be absolute, and when instinct turns against the one who decides, no. Authority remains intact for long. Before continuing, leave a like. It helps this channel grow a lot. Subscribe as well, because I have a personal dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers, and every single subscription makes a huge difference in this journey. And comment below which country you are watching from. I love reading the comments, and it helps the channel reach even more people. Now, let's get into the story. The space was still crowded when she was instructed to leave the platform. Gazes avoided hers. Some carried pity, others relief for not being the target of that public rejection. The system had achieved what it wanted, transforming a decision into an example. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was disciplined. She walked with firm steps, despite the feeling of emptiness in her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. Not because she was strong, but because she knew any reaction would be used against her. The system loved reactions. They justified exclusions. Behind her, the director remained motionless, maintaining the posture he had learned to master over the years. Straight shoulders, neutral expression. Authority had to appear intact, even when something inside him screamed in disagreement. He felt the discomfort grow like a pressure that found no exit. As soon as she crossed the exit line, the system confirmed the process's closure. Rejection recorded, compatibility denied, automatic referral initiated. Everything had occurred with impeccable efficiency, too fast for reflection, too fast for correction. He tried to move on. He tried to focus on the next names, the next reports, the next numbers, but his body didn't respond as it should. His hand trembled slightly when he tried to access the next panel. The tightening in his chest intensified, accompanied by a strange sense of loss, not of regret, but of misalignment. Something was wrong. She felt it on the other side of the corridor. The instant the door closed behind her, the humiliation lost its power, replaced by an unexpected perception. She wasn't alone in that moment, not in a concrete way, but internally, as if something had adjusted in silence. She stopped for a second, resting her hand on the cold wall. She took a deep breath. The system might have rejected her, but that new sensation didn't come from it. It didn't obey the logic that had always oppressed her. It was different, deeper. In the center of the public space, the director finally moved. He took a step back, feeling his instinct manifest with disturbing clarity, not as a fleeting emotion, but as direct opposition to the decision made. His body refused to accept the absolute control he had always believed he possessed. He knew what that meant. It wasn't weakness. It was conflict. And internal conflicts were dangerous in that position. She resumed walking, feeling something steady itself within her. The rejection still hurt, but it didn't define everything. There was a crack in that perfect system. A crack she hadn't created, only revealed. In the space she had left behind, the director took a deep breath, trying to regain his balance. He knew he needed to maintain distance. He needed to reaffirm authority. He needed to prove, to himself and to the system, that he was still in control. But his instinct did not retreat. On the contrary, every second made it clearer that something had been awakened at the moment of public rejection. Something that didn't obey orders. Something that couldn't be turned off. The system believed it had discarded her. In reality, it had initiated something that escaped its control entirely. The rejection continued to echo, not in the words spoken in public, but in the way the space seemed to reorganize itself around her. Corridors that were once neutral now carried an invisible distance. Doors opened with a minimal delay. Gazes shifted away too quickly. The system didn't need to repeat the decision. It spread it in subtle layers. She walked without haste, feeling the humiliation dissolve into something colder and more controlled. Not anger, not sadness, a kind of uncomfortable clarity. For the first time, she understood there was no error she could correct to be accepted. The rejection hadn't been an answer. It had been an imposed limit. In the control center, the director tried to recover his rhythm. The main panel projected stable data, completed decisions, normal flows. Everything indicated efficiency. Yet, his body did not follow. His instinct remained active, pressing against his authority like a muscle in continuous spasm. He knew how to recognize signs of stress. He had trained for it. What he felt now did not fit. It didn't come from overload. It came from misalignment, as if he had made a correct decision within the system, but a deeply wrong one outside of it. She felt the first reflection of this when her pace slowed down unintentionally. A strange weight formed in her chest, accompanied by a sense of unexpected proximity. It wasn't comfort. It was shared awareness. Something in her was reacting to something happening far away. She stopped, took a deep breath, trying to push the feeling away. She didn't want to cling to anything at that moment. The rejection was still too fresh. Still, the more she tried to ignore it, the more the perception took hold. In the control center, the director stepped away from the panel and walked a few paces, something unusual during public evaluations. He needed movement to contain the internal conflict. His instinct reacted every time he tried to justify the decision rationally. It didn't accept technical arguments. It didn't accept statistics. He realized, with growing unease, that he wasn't just in doubt. He was being contradicted by something that did not answer to the logic of command. She resumed her walk, feeling the alignment persist like an invisible thread. It didn't guide her steps, but it accompanied them. It didn't pull her, but it didn't break. That scared her more than the public rejection. Being discarded was something she had learned to endure. Being perceived in that way was far too new. In the control center, the director received the automatic transition warning. The system suggested proceeding with the final shutdown protocol. It was the next logical step after a public rejection. He read the notification twice, feeling the tightness in his chest intensify. That was where control should be reaffirmed. That was where instinct turned back with the most force. His hand hovered over the panel for a few seconds longer than acceptable. Long enough for the system to record hesitation. Long enough for something to define itself internally. He didn't cancel the protocol, but he didn't confirm it either. He delayed it. She felt this as a sudden and inexplicable relief. The weight lifted for an instant, as if a distant pressure had been suspended. She stopped again, confused, trying to understand what that meant. The system didn't usually back down. He hadn't backed down. He had hesitated. In the control center, the director stepped away from the panel, aware that this delay would be analyzed. It didn't matter. Something inside him needed space to exist before it was crushed by absolute control. She moved forward, now with the nagging certainty that the public rejection hadn't ended anything, It had opened something that neither of them fully understood. The system believed it was still in command, but instinct had already placed itself in opposition. And when that happens, no decision remains intact for long. His hesitation did not go unnoticed. The system recorded the delay as a minimal variation, statistically acceptable, yet enough to trigger internal monitoring layers. Nothing visible, nothing immediate, just heightened attention on every next move. Control isn't lost all at once. It is tested, little by little. She felt the consequence of this attention as she entered the transition wing. The environment seemed too neutral, as if every detail had been softened to avoid provoking reactions. That wasn't kindness. It was preparation. The system used to make people predictable before shutting them down. She took a deep breath, feeling her entire body adjust. The public rejection still echoed, but something inside her was beginning to reorganize. It wasn't a newly discovered strength. It was the removal of an old weight, the constant need to prove her worth. Without that demand, only presence remained. In the control center, the director watched the indicators with growing discomfort. The delay had created a friction point, small, but real. The system didn't demand blind obedience. It demanded consistency, and at that moment, he wasn't being consistent with himself. Instinct reacted whenever he tried to rationalize. It didn't accept the graphs. It didn't accept the percentages. Something in that specific rejection had crossed a line he hadn't noticed before. Not just because of her, but because of what it revealed about the very control he exercised. She walked a few more meters until the feeling of alignment intensified again. It wasn't physical proximity. It was continuous recognition, as if every step confirmed something that had already been decided in another layer, beyond the system's reach. She stopped again, leaning on the cold handrail. She couldn't explain what she felt. She only knew she wasn't being pushed toward the end. There was an invisible pause sustaining that moment, and pauses didn't happen without a reason. In the control center, the director received a cross-review notification. Not an accusation, but a forced invitation to justify the decision across multiple levels. That meant exposure. The system wanted to understand why that specific rejection had generated internal noise. He felt his instinct steady itself, not in direct opposition, but in alert. Explaining too much would be dangerous. Explaining too little would be as well. The system accepted technical answers, not internal conflicts. Yet, the conflict already existed. She resumed her walk when the wing door opened automatically. No sound warning, no escort. That was strange. Public rejections were usually followed by clear containment. The system was waiting. She realized, with a light shiver, that it wasn't she who was being tested at that moment. It was him. In the control center, the director chose his words carefully when responding. To the review, he used neutral terms, accepted metrics, justifications that didn't lie but didn't explain everything either. Each sentence was a fragile balance between maintaining authority and not silencing the instinct. The system accepted the response provisionally. Provisionally was never a good sign. She entered the waiting area feeling the environment react with artificial stability. She sat down without being instructed, noticing that no one seemed in a hurry to finalize the process. That was unusual. The system liked quick closures. The delay indicated uncertainty. In the control center, the director felt the tension accumulate. Instinct did not retreat. On the contrary, every attempt to reaffirm control made it clearer that something had been initiated at the moment of public rejection. It wasn't late empathy. It wasn't guilt. It was internal opposition. She closed her eyes for an instant, feeling her own breath align. She didn't know what would come next. She only knew that the rejection hadn't ended anything. It had displaced something fundamental. The system believed it was observing an exception. In reality, it was facing the first sign that absolute control has limits, and limits, once perceived, never cease to exist. The waiting area was not built for comfort. It was too vast to feel welcoming and too clean to allow for distractions. The system had designed that environment to keep people in emotional suspension, a place where nothing seemed hostile. But everything served as a reminder that the next step did not depend on them. She realized this as soon as she sat down. The chair was firm, the lighting constant, the silence absolute. There were no visible clocks. Time there did not matter. She maintained an upright posture, even though her body begged for rest. The public rejection still echoed, not as a sharp pain, but as a weight slowly settling in her chest. It wasn't the first time she had been rejected, but it had never been like this. Never, before so many eyes. Never by the person who, without knowing it, had become the most unstable point of that decision. She closed her eyes for a moment and felt the alignment again. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't a desire for comfort. It was a real presence, continuous, firm. Something in her reacted whenever she thought of him, and something in her calmed down when she accepted that this existed without explanation. The system could reject bodies and names. It didn't know how to handle this kind of connection. In the control center, the director remained standing before the panels, but he didn't truly see them. Data passed, graphs updated, processes followed, yet everything seemed distant, as if he were observing through a thick layer of glass. His instinct had not diminished since the rejection. On the contrary, it had become more precise, almost demanding. He noticed something disturbing. The more he tried to reaffirm authority internally, the more his instinct turned against him. It wasn't a voice saying, "Go back." It was something deeper, a physical misalignment, as if his body refused to sustain a decision that violated something essential. He had never felt that before, never in that way. A discreet warning appeared in the corner of the panel. Additional review recommended. Not mandatory yet, but close. The system was pressing, not with force, but with expectation. It expected him to conclude the process as he always had. It expected consistency. It expected absolute control. He took a deep breath, feeling the tightness in his chest intensify. For the first time since taking that position, he realized that control wasn't just something one exercised over others. It was something that had to be maintained within oneself. And at that moment, he was failing at it. In the waiting area, she felt the same pressure arise like a distant echo. It didn't come from the environment. It came from the connection. Something was being strained on the other side. She rested her hands on her knees, breathing slowly, refusing to panic. She had already learned that the system fed on uncontrolled reactions. Staying whole was her only form of resistance. She watched the door ahead without expectation. She didn't expect it to open quickly. She didn't expect justice. She only felt, with uncomfortable clarity, that this moment wasn't just about her. There was something larger at stake, something that escaped the simple logic of rejection and closure. In the control center, the director finally sat down. The gesture was rare. Directors did not sit during active processes. That in itself was a sign of instability. He slowly ran his hand over his face, feeling fatigue mixed with lucidity. He couldn't pretend nothing was happening. Instinct wouldn't allow it. He accessed the record of the rejection again. He read the cold, technical, irrefutable justifications within the system's logic. Everything was correct. Everything was within parameters. And yet, everything felt wrong. He realized then that the problem wasn't the isolated decision. It was the fact that by rejecting her publicly, something had been activated beyond the system's reach. Something that couldn't be undone with a simple command. The authority he wielded did not reach that territory. In the waiting area, she felt a subtle change in the air. Not a sound, not a light, a sense of delay, as if something that should have happened was already being postponed. That left her alert. The system hated delays. When something didn't advance, it meant internal conflict. She stood up slowly, walking a few steps through the permitted space. No alert sounded. No voice interrupted her. That confirmed her perception. The process was suspended, even if no one had said it out loud. In the control center, the director now faced a choice he never imagined he would confront. It wasn't choosing between accepting or rejecting someone. It was choosing between obeying the system or admitting, even if silently, that absolute control has flaws. And admitting that, even to himself, was dangerous. Instinct reacted with clear, almost implacable firmness. It did not accept that he moved forward as if nothing had happened. It did not accept that this rejection be just one more record. Something in him refused to allow her to be reduced to that. He realized then that instinct wasn't turning against the system out of rebellion. It was turning against him out of consistency. He had crossed a limit he didn't know existed. In the waiting area, she stopped again and closed her eyes. She felt the connection stabilize. Deep, silent. There was no promise of salvation. There was no guarantee of change. But there was something no system could erase: mutual recognition. She hadn't been rejected because she was insufficient. She was rejected because she destabilized something that needed to appear solid. In the control center, the director opened a new panel, something that wasn't part of the standard protocol. It wasn't a reversal. It wasn't an approval. It was a formal delay, justified by need for internal reassessment. That would be noticed, questioned, perhaps used against him later. He confirmed it anyway. In the waiting area, the door did not open, but the pressure diminished. She felt it immediately. The system had been forced to stop, if only temporarily, not out of compassion, out of conflict. She took a deep breath, feeling her whole body vibrate with that small, invisible victory. It wasn't the end. It wasn't justice. But it was proof that control wasn't as absolute as it seemed. In the control center, the director remained motionless for a few seconds, feeling the weight of the decision settle. He knew that delay changed everything. He knew he couldn't pretend normalcy after this. Something had been initiated, and there would be no simple return. The public rejection had not ended the story. It had only been the moment when instinct decided not to obey anymore. The formal suspension was not announced aloud. The system never did that when it needed to preserve the appearance of control. Instead, the process entered an ambiguous state where nothing advanced and nothing was officially interrupted. To someone observing from the outside, it looked like just another administrative transition. To her, it was the kind of silence that precedes something irreversible. She sat back down, feeling her body finally react to the accumulated exhaustion. The public rejection was still present, but it no longer occupied the center of her experience. What dominated now was the strange perception of being trapped in an interval created by someone who, officially, had discarded her. That contradiction made no sense within the logic she had always known. The waiting area remained unchanged, but something about it felt less oppressive. Not out of comfort, but out of hesitation. The system didn't push. It didn't lead. It simply held. This was too unusual to be ignored. She realized with growing clarity that the delay was not a favor. It was a side effect of a conflict that was not happening there. In the control center, the director felt this conflict intensify. The delay he had authorized had already been recorded across multiple layers. No direct messages yet, but the supervision indicators had become more sensitive. Every future action would be analyzed with redoubled attention. He knew this. Still, he felt no immediate regret. His instinct remained active, but now with a different quality. It wasn't disordered urgency. It was coherent insistence. Something within him refused to allow the process to continue as if nothing had happened. It was no longer just about her. It was about the very integrity of the control he exercised. He realized, with growing discomfort, that the system expected him to resolve the instability by demonstrating strength. Normally, this would mean concluding the rejection and moving toward the final shutdown. The delay was tolerable only if it led to a harsher decision later. The system always rewarded severe corrections. This realization made him close his eyes for a moment longer than acceptable. His body reacted immediately, as if recognizing the trap. Reaffirming control now would mean crushing something that could no longer be ignored, and to ignore his instinct would be, for the first time, to ignore himself. In the waiting area, she felt a sudden internal oscillation, not pain, not fear, a sudden tension, as if something had been pressed on the other side. She reflexively moved her hand to her chest, breathing carefully. The connection did not transmit thoughts, but it transmitted states, and that state was intense conflict. She realized with unsettling clarity that the delay would not protect her for long. The system tolerated ambiguities only as long as they served a larger correction. At some point, someone would have to decide, and when that happened, the decision would not be gentle. She stood up again, walking slowly through the permitted limit of the space. She didn't want to seem too passive. She didn't want to seem defiant. The line between invisibility and threat was too thin there. The system watched everything, even when it seemed not to act. In the control center, the director received the first formal request for clarification. Not an order, not an accusation. A request for additional justification. This meant the delay was no longer invisible. Now, it needed to be sustained by something more than intuition. He read the request with forced calm. The words were neutral, but the subtext was clear. explain why this case did not follow the expected flow. He knew how to answer technically. He knew how to point out variables, margins of error, the need for review. All of that would be accepted. All of that would be insufficient, because instinct did not manifest in data. He typed a short, deliberately incomplete response. He indicated the need for additional observation due to inconsistencies perceived during the public evaluation. Nothing emotional, nothing accusatory, just enough to justify more time. As he hit send, he felt the weight of the decision deepen. In the waiting area, she felt the effect almost immediately. The pressure did not decrease, but it changed in quality. It became more focused, denser. The system had officially recorded that something was outside the norm. This placed her in a dangerous position. Being an exception was worse than being rejected. She sat down again, feeling mental fatigue spread. She couldn't control what was happening on the other side. She couldn't predict the final decision. All she could do was remain whole, without fragmenting herself to fit expectations that had already failed. She then realized something that surprised her. The public rejection had not diminished her internal worth. On the contrary, by being discarded so explicitly, something in her had stopped seeking validation from that system. This liberation was subtle, but powerful. In the control center, the director felt a similar reaction, though for different reasons. The authority he had always upheld was beginning to feel too heavy. For the first time, he wondered if absolute control was not a sophisticated form of fear of dealing with what cannot be predicted. His instinct reacted to this thought with quiet firmness. It didn't accuse, it didn't demand, it simply remained, reminding him that ignoring it now would have too high an internal cost. He wouldn't know how to go back to being the same person afterward. The system responded to the justification with a provisional acceptance. More time granted, expanded monitoring. This meant constant surveillance. Any slip would be used as proof of decisional instability. He knew this. Still, he felt a contained relief. In the waiting area, the door remained closed. No escort. No new instructions. The delay had officially consolidated. It wasn't safety. It was prolonged exposure. She knew this could turn against her at any moment. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, feeling the connection stabilize again. There was no comfort, but there was coherence. What was happening was not random. It was the direct consequence of something awakened the moment of the public rejection. In the control center, the director watched the panels with a bitter clarity. The system was now too attentive. There would be no more discrete decisions. Every movement would carry political, structural, and personal weight. He understood, with uncomfortable sharpness, that he had crossed an invisible limit. He couldn't simply resolve this and move on. His instinct wouldn't allow it, and the system wouldn't forget. In the waiting area, she opened her eyes, feeling her body tired but firm. She didn't know what the future would bring. She only knew that something fundamental had changed. The rejection was no longer the center of the story. Control had been questioned, and when control begins to fail from the inside, no structure remains intact for long. The expanded surveillance altered the dynamics of everything without changing anything visible. The waiting area remained the same, the lighting constant, the silence controlled. Still, she felt the environment as if it were closer, almost too attentive. The system didn't need to move to exert pressure. It was enough to observe with sufficient intensity. Every gesture, every breath, every minute change was recorded as a possibility, not of error, of confirmation. She remained seated for long minutes, perhaps hours. There was no way to know. Time there did not follow a human rhythm. Fatigue came in waves, mixed with a strange lucidity. The public rejection now seemed distant, as if it had occurred in another life. What remained was something deeper, the clear sensation that she was being held in suspension, not because of doubt about her worth, but because of a conflict in another layer. That thought pierced her with unexpected force. For the first time, she didn't feel at the center of the judgment. She felt at the center of a dispute that wasn't about her, but that used her presence as a point of tension. This perception didn't empower her. It frightened her. Being the axis of an invisible conflict was too dangerous to be romanticized. In the control center, the director felt the same displacement. He was no longer evaluating someone. He was being evaluated along with the decision he had made. The system did not confront him directly. It merely created contexts where his authority needed to continually reaffirm itself. Unexpected meetings, redundant requests, small delays in access that were once instantaneous. Nothing accusatory, everything strategic. Instinct reacted to each of these pressures with growing firmness, not as an impulse for direct protection of her, but as resistance to the repeating pattern. His body recognized something deeply wrong in the way the system tried to force him to correct a decision that, technically, was already correct. That revealed a structural fear. The system did not tolerate hesitation in authority figures. He realized, with growing discomfort, that he was being pushed into a clear role. Either he would reaffirm control in an exemplary way, closing the case with extreme rigidity, or he would be gradually displaced from the decision-making core. The system did not punish openly. It redefined relevance. In the waiting space, she felt a sudden change in her body. Not pain, not panic, an intense, almost cutting clarity, as if something had organized itself internally. She realized she could not remain there indefinitely, even if the system held her. Prolonged suspension was another form of erasure. There was no formal exclusion, but there was a slow dissolution. She stood up and walked a few steps, feeling the weight of the observation increase. Still, she kept her pace calm. Not reacting was an active choice now. Every controlled gesture was a refusal to provide the system with what it wanted. Emotional predictability. The connection manifested with a rare stability. There was no urgency, no tension spikes, just a firm presence, as if saying that this state of shared consciousness no longer depended on the initial chaos. This surprised her. The bond did not weaken over time. It became more precise. In the control center, the director felt the same alignment as an uncomfortable clarity. There was no longer any way to treat it as a passing reaction to stress. Instinct was not dissipating. It was consolidating, and that required a decision he had avoided until then, to stop reacting only defensively. He opened a panel he rarely used, not because of formal restriction, but because of political implication. A decisional impact record. It wasn't a common report. It was a space where controversial decisions were documented with their side effects over time. This created institutional memory, and institutional memories could not be easily erased. Starting that record meant admitting that the public rejection had generated consequences beyond what was foreseen, not just for her, but for the system itself. It was a silent admission of a limit. In the waiting space, she felt the change almost immediately, not in the environment, but in the connection. Something deepened, as if it had been anchored in a more stable layer. The constant pressure decreased a bit, replaced by a sense of support, not absolute protection, but coherence. She sat back down, feeling the physical fatigue finally manifest. Her body trembled slightly, not from fear, but from wear and tear. Still, there was something new there. She didn't feel weak. She felt whole, even though exhausted. That was unprecedented. In the control center, alerts began to surface more frequently. The system recorded the start of the impact record as a sensitive action. Higher supervision would be notified. Questions would come. He knew. Still, he did not back down. The decision did not come from the mind now. It came from a deeper alignment. He realized with almost painful clarity that the control he had always exercised was not just external. It was internal. And maintaining that control now would mean violating himself to fit into a structure that did not accept human flaws. Instinct refused to allow that. In the waiting space, she closed her eyes for an instant, feeling her breath align with something more stable. She didn't know if she would leave there approved, rejected, or forgotten. She only knew she could not go back to who she was before. The public rejection had broken something, not in her, but in the way she saw herself within that system. She no longer needed to prove her belonging. In the control center, the director watched the system react subtly to the new record. No blocks, no orders, just a heavier silence, loaded with expectation. The system didn't like memory. It preferred quick decisions, clean endings. He was creating something that could not be ended easily. In the waiting space, she opened her eyes, feeling the weight of that interval. There was no evident climax, no resolution. But there was a clear certainty. The public rejection had been the breaking point. From there, everything had become more dangerous and more true. The system believed it could still correct the deviation. But instinct had already chosen not to obey blindly. And when that happens, no structure remains untouched for long. Institutional memory began to produce its effects, even before it was read by those who mattered. Not because anyone had opened the record, but because the system reacted to its mere existence. The structure was not designed to coexist with decisions that remain open. It preferred clear endings, conclusions that allowed it to move forward without noise. An impact record was the opposite, a fixed point that prevented forgetting, and forgetting had always been one of the most effective tools of control. In the waiting area, she felt this reaction as a slight internal displacement, almost imperceptible but constant. There was no change in lighting, no new warnings. Yet, the air felt denser, as if the environment were waiting for something. Not an order, a confirmation. She took a deep breath, feeling the exhaustion in her shoulders, but also a silent firmness in the center of her chest. The public rejection no longer defined her thoughts. What occupied her now was the awareness that she was no longer being treated as a common case. She noticed this when a figure appeared in the distance and stopped before approaching. It wasn't an escort. It wasn't a clear authority. It was cautious observation. Someone waiting for instructions that didn't come. The system was creating intermediaries, trying to buy time while it decided the next step. That hesitation was rare, and therefore dangerous. In the control center, the director observed the same signs with sharp attention. The creation of intermediaries indicated that the system was avoiding direct responsibility. When this happened, decisions tended to fragment, diluting blame and making contestation difficult. He knew that movement. He had used it before. Now, he was its target. Instinct reacted with an almost cutting clarity. Fragmentation would solve nothing. It would only push the conflict into deeper layers, where corrections would become more violent. If the system managed to turn the rejection into a sequence of small decisions, no one could point to the exact moment the control had failed. And without an exact moment, there was no way to hold anyone accountable. He needed to prevent this dilution. In the waiting area, she walked a few steps and stopped, conscious of every movement. She didn't want to provoke. She didn't want to disappear. She wanted to exist with integrity, without dramatic concessions. The connection remained stable, almost silent, as if saying that this was a moment of sustainment, not of advancement. She trusted it, even without fully understanding. The presence of the distant figure remained. No approach, no retreat. That confirmed her suspicion. The system didn't know what to do with her now. The public rejection had created a visible closure, but the delay in the memory had opened an invisible crack. And cracks require time. In the control center, the director made a decision that would widen that crack. He linked the impact record to a cross-sectional category, something rarely used and politically sensitive. This meant that the case could no longer be resolved by a single sector. It required collective review, prolonged debate, formal disagreement. The system hated this, but it could not ignore it. Upon confirming the link, he felt the weight of the choice settle with full force. There was no simple way back. Any outcome now would have to be justified before multiple layers. The rejection had ceased to be an isolated act. It had become a systemic problem. In the waiting area, she felt the consequence as a strange relief mixed with apprehension. The constant pressure had eased slightly, replaced by something more diffuse. It wasn't safety. It was visibility without attack, the kind of state that might last only a short time, but that changes the dynamic completely. She sat down again, resting her hands on her knees, feeling her entire body vibrate with accumulated fatigue. For the first time since the rejection, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what had happened. She didn't cry, not out of strength, but because something inside her had shifted its axis. The humiliation had lost its center. What remained was a strange, silent dignity. In the control center, alerts began to appear more frequently, though still without a critical tone. The system recorded the case as under expanded evaluation. This created a dangerous administrative limbo. People caught in expanded evaluations were not excluded quickly, but they were not integrated either. They remained in suspension for an indefinite amount of time. He knew this, and he knew that prolonged suspension was another form of punishment. Instinct reacted firmly. It did not accept that this should turn into an infinite wait. It did not accept that the public rejection be replaced by a slow erasure. If memory had been created, there had to be a real consequence. Not immediate, but concrete. In the waiting area, she felt the same restlessness arise. The easing of pressure brought clarity, and clarity brought an uncomfortable question. What now? Being held there indefinitely was not a solution. It was a postponement of the end. The system might not know what to do with her, but that didn't mean it would let her exist outside its rules. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the connection deepen with steady calm. There was no explicit guidance, no images, no words, just the clear feeling that this impasse could not last forever. Something would have to give. In the control center, the director began to prepare a second move, subtler and riskier. He wouldn't directly interfere in her process. He would interfere in the very criteria that had made the rejection possible. He accessed histories of similar decisions, cases where public rejections had been used to reinforce control. The patterns were clear, the consequences ignored. He began to correlate data, not to accuse the I system, but to show that this method produced measurable side effects. A drop in collective performance, an increase in silent attrition, prolonged emotional instability. None of this was new. It had just never been connected to the practice. As he compiled this data, he felt his instinct align with an almost cold precision. This wasn't personal protection. It was structural correction. If the system were forced to face the effects of its own performative authority, it would have to review the method or bear the cost. In the waiting area, she felt a sudden shift in the internal atmosphere, not in the physical environment. Inside her, the feeling of being at the mercy of others diminished, not because she was safe, but because something larger was being confronted, that both scared and strengthened her. She didn't want to be the cause of anything, but she couldn't deny that she was at the center of that confrontation. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling firm despite the tiredness. The distant figure still waited, motionless. No orders arrived. The system continued to hesitate, and hesitation in that world was a sign that something no longer fit as it used to. In the control center, the director sent the compilation to the same cross-sectional circuit, not as a denunciation, as context. That expanded the problem beyond her case. It turned the public rejection into a symptom, not a solution. The system would have to respond, even if only by officially denying everything. He knew that action would have a personal cost. Influence would be reduced. The blind trust in his authority would be questioned. Still, he did not back down. Instinct no longer allowed for half measures. In the waiting area, she felt the effect like a weight being reorganized. It didn't disappear. It changed shape. The pressure was now accompanied by expectation, not hers, the system's. Something was being prepared, and it wasn't a simple closure. She took a deep breath, feeling her own body, present, whole. She didn't know if she would leave there approved, rejected again, or forgotten. She only knew she couldn't return to her previous state. The public rejection had been a point of no return. In the control center, the director stepped away from the panels for a few seconds, something unthinkable in the middle of an expanded evaluation. He needed to feel his own body, to confirm he was still aligned with what he was doing. He was. Instinct remained firm, silent, implacable. He understood, with a clarity that left him breathless, that control had not been challenged out of rebellion. It had been challenged out of coherence, and coherence, when it arises, cannot be eliminated without too high a cost. In the waiting area, she opened her eyes and faced the door ahead. For the first time, she didn't expect it to open by permission. She only expected that, when it opened, something would have truly changed. The system still believed it could absorb the impact, but the impact was accumulating. And systems that accumulate impact without resolving it begin to crack from the inside. The door did not open immediately. The system rarely made direct moves when under internal pressure. It preferred to create intermediate layers, decisions that seemed neutral, almost inevitable. The wait was prolonged in a calculated manner, and she realized that this was not forgetfulness. It was preparation. Every additional second served to align instances, recalibrate narratives, and reduce the risk of explicit exposure. She remained standing, feeling the weight of her own body, feeling the floor beneath her feet as something too concrete for that world of abstractions. The distant figure remained motionless, as if it were part of the scenery. There was no open hostility. There was something more dangerous, a silent, collective expectation. She took a deep breath, refusing to anticipate what was coming. Anticipation was a form of emotional submission that the system exploited with efficiency. In the control center, the director watched the instances begin to converge, not toward a final decision, but toward a common frame. When this happened, the system was preparing to justify any outcome as an inevitable consensus. He knew that mechanism better than anyone. He had used it to close complex cases without appearing authoritarian. Now he saw it being assembled around something he was not willing to sacrifice. Instinct reacted with growing firmness, not with chaotic urgency, but with a clarity that eliminated comfortable alternatives. The system was trying to transform the conflict into a procedure. He needed to prevent that from happening. Procedures absorb dissent. They transform ruptures into acceptable statistics. That would erase what had been revealed in the moment of public rejection. In the waiting area, she felt a subtle change, almost imperceptible, as if the environment had been reconfigured to allow for a smooth transition. The lighting took on a more neutral tone. The air seemed less dense. That wasn't relief. It was anesthesia. The system was preparing the ground for a decision that needed to seem reasonable, humane, and technically defensible. She recognized the pattern with a bitter lucidity. She had been there before, in other contexts, other institutions. Whenever someone said, "Let's talk," it meant the decision was almost already made. The talk served only to reduce emotional impact. She felt the connection react, not with an alert, but with steady stability. It helped her not to be swept away by the false smoothness of the moment. In the control center, the director received confirmation that a realignment session would be initiated. It wasn't a judgment. It wasn't a formal hearing. It was an intermediate space where decisions were presented as necessary adjustments. He knew what it meant. The system was about to frame the rejection as correct, but poorly executed. The solution would be to reaffirm control, with a more careful narrative. Instinct reacted against this reading with silent force. It did not accept the idea of a cosmetic fix. The public rejection had not just been a flaw in form. It had been the manifestation of a method that needed to be questioned. Adjusting the discourse without touching the practice would be the worst possible betrayal of what had been awakened. In the waiting area, the door finally opened with a movement too smooth to be neutral. There was no alarm sound. There was no announcement, just the clear opening, inviting, almost respectful. The distant figure made a restrained gesture, indicating she could follow. This was not an escort. It was symbolic guidance. The system wanted to appear reasonable. She walked with firm steps, feeling every muscle respond to the movement. She didn't hurry. She didn't hesitate. Every step was a silent affirmation of presence. As she crossed the threshold, she felt the connection stabilize even further, as if that movement were necessary to align something that had been in suspension for too long. In the control center, the director monitored the displacement through indirect indicators. No images, no precise maps, just confirmed transition signals. He felt the tightness in his chest intensify. The realignment session was the last stage before an elegant closure. If he didn't act now, everything would be absorbed by the procedure. He made the riskiest decision of his entire career. He would not interfere in the session. He would interfere in the context of the session. He opened the transversal record and attached a framing note. Not an accusation, not an order, a principle. He declared that public rejection decisions could no longer be considered isolated acts, but events of systemic impact requiring mandatory structural review. That didn't cancel the session. It changed its meaning. As he sent it, he felt the weight of the risk solidify. From that moment on, any decision made there would be linked to a larger review. The system could not close the case without recognizing the method. In the realignment space, she felt the change before a single word was spoken, not by magic, but by coherence. The connection reacted with a firm, almost motionless pulse. There was no euphoria. There was no fear. There was full presence. She sat down when indicated, maintaining an open posture, without exaggerated submission, without explicit defiance. The first words were measured, careful, full of neutral terms. They spoke of context, of expectations, of alignment of values. Nothing about rejection, nothing about humiliation. That confirmed everything she already knew. The system wanted to rewrite the event as a misunderstanding. She listened in silence, feeling her entire body attentive. She didn't let herself be carried away by the smooth language. She waited. The connection remained stable, like an internal axis preventing her from getting lost in the discourse. In the control center, the director followed the effects of the framing note. Discrete alerts appeared, indicating that the session had been reclassified. It could no longer produce a simple closure. Any decision would have to be documented as part of a larger process. The system was being forced to slow down. He felt instinct align with a rare tranquility. There was no longer desperate urgency. There was clear direction. Whatever happened in that session, it would not be absorbed without leaving marks. In the realignment space, when they finally asked her to speak, the atmosphere seemed suspended, not out of emotional expectation, but out of calculation. The system needed something from her to complete the narrative, a request for reconsideration, an admission of failure, anything that would allow the cycle to close with the appearance of balance. She took a deep breath and spoke calmly. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain herself. She simply described how the public rejection had affected not her performance, but the structure around it. She spoke of the subsequent silence, the delay, the suspension. She spoke of the inconsistency between absolute control and the constant need to reaffirm it publicly. She accused no one. She asked for nothing. She spoke of limits. The words were not inflammatory, but they were precise. Each sentence stripped away a layer of the comfortable narrative the system was trying to build. When she finished, the silence that followed was not disciplined. It was real. In the control center, the director felt the impact as a profound confirmation. Instinct had not turned against control on a whim. It had turned because control revealed itself to be fragile when exposed to simple coherence. Alerts began to arise with more intensity, not of technical failure, but of narrative conflict. The session produced no consensus. The answers did not fit. The system was being forced to deal with something that could not be softened. In the realignment space, she remained seated, feeling her own body present, firm. She didn't know what would come next. She only knew she had not yielded what was essential. The public rejection had not been nullified, but it had also not been absorbed. In the control center, the director stepped away from the screen for a moment, feeling the weight of the choice settle. He knew that from that point on, there would be no elegant closure. The system would have to choose between maintaining the appearance of control, bearing the cost, or admitting that the method needed to change. Instinct remained firm, silent, implacable. The public rejection had been the beginning. Now control was being observed from the inside, and that was irreversible. The silence that settled after her words was neither immediate nor absolute. It was a constructed silence, heavy, the kind the system could not fill with technical terms or intermediary protocols. No one interrupted. No one rushed the conclusion. That, in itself, was a grave failure. Realignment sessions existed to conclude, not to remain open. The fact that they continued to sit there indicated that something essential had slipped out of control. She kept her gaze firm, not defiant, not submissive. She felt her heart beating strongly but steadily. There was no regret for what she had said. Her words had not been strategic. They had been true. And in that environment, truth was the most unstable element of all. The system could correct data, adjust narratives, and redistribute responsibilities. It did not know what to do when someone refused to mold themselves to the expected discourse. The connection remained solid, almost invisible, but present like an internal pillar. She realized that if that bond had been fragile, it would have already yielded to fear or the need to please. It wasn't sudden bravery. It was something deeper. The silent certainty that yielding now would mean denying something essential that had awakened the moment of the public. Rejection. In the control center, the director watched the session lose its expected shape. Narrative indicators did not converge. Answers generated ramifications instead of closure. The system began to record this as discursive instability. It was a rare term, used when consensus could not be built without excessive force. And excessive force, at that moment, would have too high a cost. He felt his instinct react with almost physical clarity. This wasn't an isolated error. It was the direct consequence of a method that had sustained itself for too long without being questioned. The public rejection had only been the trigger. What was unfolding now was the accumulation of small inconsistencies that the system had always ignored because it functioned too fast to feel the impact. In the realignment room, someone finally spoke, but the voice sounded different. There was no clear authority in the tone. It was caution. They asked if she had anything more to add. The question wasn't neutral. It was an attempt to pull her back into the narrative game, offering her a chance to soften, relativize, or collaborate with the closure. She took a deep breath before answering. She felt her whole body present, heavy but firm. She didn't need to add facts. She didn't need to convince. What she needed to do was not undo what had already been said. So she replied with few words, saying that she did not seek immediate revision, nor public recognition. She simply did not accept that what had happened be treated as normal. Those words produced an immediate effect. Not indignation, not reproach, a displacement. The system did not know where to fit someone who asked for neither reparation nor submission. That dismantled the standard script. Reparations could be granted. Submission could be exploited. Silent refusal was something that generated no predictable return. In the control center, alerts began to surface at higher layers. The session had been marked as unresolved. This was rare, dangerous. Unresolved sessions required structural referral. They could not be forgotten. They needed to be reassessed by instances that the system preferred to keep distant from individual cases. The director felt the weight of that consequence settle with definitive clarity. The public rejection would not be absorbed. It would not be softened. It had transformed into a point of reference, not because of protest nor scandal, but because someone had refused to collaborate with the normalization of the abuse of control. In the room, the symbolic guidance lost its strength. No one indicated the exit. No one formally concluded. The system was, for the first time in a long time, without a clear script. That created a type of institutional vulnerability rarely seen. And vulnerability, once perceived, never completely disappears. She felt her exhaustion deepen, but also a strange serenity. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if it would put her at greater risk. She only knew she couldn't go back. The public rejection had been an attempt to reduce her. Her response had been simply to exist outside the imposed role. In the control center, the director stepped away from the screens for a few seconds. He needed to feel his own body to confirm he was still aligned with that implicit choice. He was. Instinct remained firm, silent, without urgency. It didn't demand that he save anyone. It only demanded that he not allow this to be buried. He realized, with bitter clarity, that his authority would never be the same after that day. Not because he would lose his position immediately, but because he had ceased to be just an operator of the system. He had become a point of friction within it, and systems do not forget friction. They try to neutralize, absorb, or isolate it. In the room, they finally announced that the session would be closed without conclusion and referred for expanded review. The words were chosen carefully, but the meaning was clear. Nothing had been resolved, and that, in that context, was more disruptive than any harsh decision. She stood up when indicated, feeling her body heavy but whole. There was no rigid escort, no immediate order, just a neutral leading out of that space. The system no longer knew if she was a problem to be eliminated or a limit to be respected. In the control center, the director watched the confirmation of the referral with a paradoxical feeling. It wasn't victory, it wasn't relief. It was the certainty that absolute control had been exposed as fragile. The public rejection, designed to reinforce authority, had produced the opposite effect. He understood, in that instant, that instinct had not turned against control out of emotion. It had turned because it recognized something the system could not admit. Authority that needs to humiliate to assert itself is already in collapse. She walked down the corridor feeling the connection remained stable, deep, silent. It promised no future. It guaranteed no safety. It only confirmed that something essential had been preserved. Not her position, not her status, her integrity. The system still functioned. The lights came on. The doors opened. The routines followed. But something had changed. The public rejection had not been forgotten. The instinct had not retreated. And control, once observed from the inside, could never pretend to be absolute again. The referral to an expanded review produced no immediate reaction. The system never reacted when something placed it before its own limits. It preferred time to dilute impacts, reorganize narratives, and redistribute responsibilities. Still, that case did not settle, not because it was loud, but because it remained present without asking for attention. A presence that does not beg for a solution is the greatest possible challenge for a structure based on control. She noticed this the following day when she was relocated to a provisional space. It wasn't a cell. It wasn't freedom. It was functional neutrality. An environment that existed only to keep someone out of the main flow without declaring exclusion. The system kept her there not out of care, but because it didn't know where to place her without admitting a contradiction. She walked through the space with slow steps, feeling her body tired but stable. The public rejection now seemed distant, almost unreal, as if it had happened to another body. What remained was not pain, but lucidity. She knew she hadn't won anything. She also knew she hadn't been defeated. She was in a rarer state, unassimilable. In the control center, the director felt the same displacement. The expanded review had activated layers he rarely saw in full operation. Instances that did not answer to a single authority. Groups that analyzed impact, not intention. The system was being forced to look at the method, not just the result. And methods, when exposed, cannot be corrected without a political cost. He watched the reports surface in silence. They weren't direct accusations. They were uncomfortable questions. Why did public rejections produce more instability than silent corrections? Why did control need to be performed in front of everyone? Why did authority seem to depend on occasional humiliation to reaffirm itself? These questions didn't cite names. They didn't mention the case directly. Still, he knew everything had started there. In the instant, the instinct had turned against his own decision. She felt the connection remain firm, now almost peaceful. There was no more constant tension, no sudden spikes. It was like an internal axis that didn't need to be activated all the time. That surprised her. The bond didn't exist to protect her from every threat. It existed to remind her of something essential, to not reduce herself again. She sat near the narrow window of the provisional space, observing a world that moved on normally. People transited. Systems functioned. Decisions were made. Nothing seemed different to those who didn't know where to look. Still, she knew something had been displaced. The system now carried a memory that couldn't be erased without admitting failure. In the control center, the director realized the personal consequence of this, with bitter clarity. His direct influence had diminished, not by explicit punishment, but by careful redistribution. Invitations stopped arriving. Decisions began to be made without prior consultation. He hadn't been removed. He had been neutralized in an elegant way, and yet he felt no regret. The instinct remained aligned, silent, firm. It didn't demand a recovery of power. It didn't demand immediate justice. It only confirmed that what had been done needed to exist, that allowing the erasure of that event would have been an irreversible internal betrayal. She realized this too, in a different way. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to anticipate the next judgment. She didn't try to imagine how she should act to be accepted. The system could keep her there indefinitely. It could even try to erase her bit by bit. Still, something fundamental could not be taken away. She no longer needed to ask for permission to exist. In the control center, the first results of the review began to circulate. Not conclusions, but trends. They indicated that public rejections, while efficient in the short term, produced corrosive effects in the medium term. Silent fear, superficial obedience, loss of creativity, an increase in invisible attrition. None of this was new. It just had never been connected to the practice so clearly. He read every line with contained attention. It didn't absolve anyone. It also didn't condemn directly, but it made it impossible to feign ignorance. The method had been exposed as flawed, and flawed methods demand change, or the conscious acceptance of the damage. She felt the reflection of this when she received a brief neutral notification, informing her that her situation would remain under observation, without immediate execution. It wasn't freedom. But it wasn't exclusion either. It was something the system rarely granted: time without clear punishment. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, feeling the weight of that state. She didn't celebrate. She knew time could be used against her. Still, she felt no fear. She felt something rarer: internal autonomy. Even if she were removed from there in the future, she would no longer be the same person who accepted humiliation as the price of belonging. In the control center, the director stepped away from his desk at the end of the shift, something he never did without reviewing everything for a third time. That day, he didn't review it. He knew that what needed to happen was already in motion, beyond the reach of individual decisions. He understood, with silent clarity, that the instinct had not turned against control out of emotional rebellion. It had turned because it recognized a truth too, simple to be ignored. Control that needs to humiliate to sustain itself has already lost its legitimacy. She looked again through the narrow window, feeling her body tired but whole. She didn't know if she would be integrated, freed, or kept there indefinitely. She only knew that something essential had been preserved: her voice, her integrity, her refusal to collaborate with her own reduction. The system would continue functioning. It would continue rejecting. It would continue correcting. But now it carried a silent crack, a rejection that was not absorbed, an instinct that did not obey, a presence that remained without asking for permission. And when that happens, no authority remains untouched for long. The story did not end with acceptance, nor with exemplary punishment. It ended with something more dangerous: awareness. If this story kept you gripped until now, leave a like right now. It helps this video reach more people. Subscribe to the channel too, because I have a personal dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers, and every single subscription makes a huge difference on this journey. And comment below which country you are watching from. I read all the comments, and they help the channel grow and keep bringing stories like this one. Thank you for staying until the end. She was rejected in public to serve as an example, but examples only work when no one questions the method. The system believed that to humiliate was to control, that to expose was to correct, that authority needed to be feared to exist. On that day, something simple happened. Instinct refused to obey, not out of emotion, but out of coherence. She didn't win. She wasn't celebrated. She received no immediate justice, and yet she remained whole, because there are losses that set you free, and refusals that reveal more about the one who rejects than the one who is rejected. The director believed he controlled all the variables. He discovered that some truths do not take orders. This story was not about acceptance. It was about the moment when control reveals its cracks, and when someone stops collaborating with their own reduction, the system may even keep functioning, but never again in the same way.